Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, Book 3. A man is praised or blamed only for his voluntary acts. Involuntary acts, committed in ignorance or under compulsion, may be forgiven. Moral purpose is a deliberate desire to bring about something good within our power to be accomplished. Courage and temperance are moral virtues that represent means. The former a mean between the vices of cowardliness and foolhardiness in our attitude toward things terrifying. The latter between licentiousness and insensibility in our attitude toward bodily pleasure. Chapter 1. As virtue is concerned with emotion and action, and emotions and actions that are voluntary are objects for praise or blame, while those that are involuntary are objects for pardon and sometimes for pity, we must, I think, in a study of virtue, distinguish the voluntary from the involuntary. It will also be useful for lawmakers, for its bearing on the award of honors and punishments. Acts done under compulsion or from ignorance are generally considered involuntary. An act is compulsory if its origin is external to the doer or sufferer. That is, if it is one to which the doer or sufferer contributes nothing, as if, for example, the wind, or people who have us in their power, were to carry us in a certain direction. But if an act is performed for fear of some greater evil, or for some noble end, as, for example, if a tyrant who had our parents and children in his power were to order us to do some shameful act on condition that, if we did, their lives would be spared, and, if not, they would be put to death, it is questionable whether such an act is voluntary or involuntary. The act of throwing goods overboard during a storm at sea is of the same sort, for nobody would voluntarily make such a sacrifice in the abstract. Yet every sensible person will make it for his own safety and that of his companions. Acts like these are of a mixed character, yet more like voluntary than involuntary acts, for they are the results of choice at the time, and the end of the act is a result of the choice made at the moment of performing it. When we speak then of an action as voluntary or involuntary, we must regard the occasion when it was performed. The person whose acts we are here considering acts voluntarily, for in acts like this, the power which sets the machinery of his limbs in motion is in himself, and when the origin of anything is in the person himself, it lies with him either to do it or not to do it. Such actions then are voluntary, although in the abstract they may be called involuntary, because nobody would choose any such act in itself. Such acts are at times objects of praise. When men submit to something shameful or painful for the sake of gaining something great and noble, in a contrary case, they are objects of blame, for only a bad man would submit to something utterly shameful, if his object were ignoble or only trivial. Some acts are pardonable, though not praiseworthy, as when a person is induced to do wrong by pressure too strong for human nature, that no one could resist. Yet there are acts, perhaps, we cannot be compelled to do. We should rather suffer the most dreadful form of death than do them. So the reasons which forced Alcmenon in Euripides to murder his mother are clearly ridiculous. It is sometimes difficult to determine what ought to be chosen or endured in order to obtain or avoid a certain result, but it is still more difficult to abide by our decisions. For it generally happens that the consequence we expect is painful, and the act we are forced to do is shameful. Therefore we receive blame or praise according as we yield or do not yield to the constraint. What class of acts, then, may rightly be called compulsory? Acts may be called absolutely compulsory whenever the cause is external to the doer and he contributes nothing. But when an act, though involuntary in itself, is chosen at a particular time and for a particular end, and when its cause is in the doer himself, then, though the act is involuntary in itself, it is voluntary at that time and for that end. Such an act is more like a voluntary act than an involuntary act, for actions come under the class of particular things, and in the supposed case, the particular act is voluntary, and what kind of acts should be chosen for what ends is not easy to state, as particular cases admit of many differences. Someone might argue that whatever is pleasant or noble is compulsory on us, because pleasures and nobleness are forces external to ourselves. But if that were so, every act would be compulsory, as these are the motives of all our acts. Also, if a person acts under compulsion and against his will, his act is painful to him. But if he is influenced to act by pleasure and nobleness, it is pleasant. It is absurd to lay the blame of our wrongdoings on external causes rather than on the facility with which we are caught by such influences, and take the credit of our noble actions ourselves, while laying the blame of our shameful acts on pleasure. An act then is compulsory if its origin is outside the doer, or if the person who is compelled contributes nothing to the act. Chapter 2. An act committed in ignorance is never voluntary, but it is not involuntary, unless it is followed by pain and regret. For a person who does something, whatever it may be, from ignorance, and yet feels no distress at his act, has not, it is true, acted voluntarily, since he did not know what he was doing. But on the other hand, he has not acted involuntarily, so long as he feels no regret. If a person who has acted from ignorance regrets what he has done, he may be called an involuntary agent. But a person who does not regret it is a different case, and he may be called a non-voluntary agent. For, since he differs from the other, it is better he should have a special name. There is a difference, too, it would seem, between acting from ignorance and acting in ignorance. Thus, if a person is intoxicated or enraged, he is not regarded as acting from ignorance, but as acting from intoxication or rage. Yet he does not act consciously, but in ignorance. Every wicked person we know is ignorant of what he ought to do and what he ought not to do, and ignorance is the error which makes people unjust and generally bad. But when we speak of an action as involuntary, we do not mean merely that a person is ignorant of his true interest. The ignorance which causes involuntary action, as distinguished from that which causes wickedness, is not that which affects the moral purpose, nor again is it ignorance of the universal, for that is blameworthy. It is rather ignorance of particulars, that is, of the particular circumstances and occasion of the act. Where this ignorance exists, there is room for pity and forgiveness, since one who is ignorant of such particulars is an involuntary actor. It will be well then to define the nature and number of these particulars. They are 1. Who is acting? 2. What is the act? 3. The occasion or circumstances of the act. Sometimes also 4. The instrument, for instance, the tool. 5. The aim, for instance, safety. 6. The manner of doing the act, for instance, gently or violently. Nobody but a madman could be ignorant of all these particulars. Clearly, too, no one could be ignorant of the actor, for how could a person be ignorant of himself? But he might not know what he was doing, as when people say a word slipped from them unawares, or they did not know something was secret, like Aeschylus when he revealed the mysteries, or he might only have meant to show the working of a weapon when he discharged it, like the man who discharged the catapult. Again, a person might take his son for an enemy, like Merope, or a pointed foil for one with its button on, or a solid stone for a pumice stone. Or he might kill somebody by a drink that was meant to save him. Or he might strike a fatal blow while only intending, as in a sparring match, to show how to strike. Since there may be ignorance in regard to all these particular circumstances of an act, a person may be said to have acted involuntarily, if he was ignorant of any one of them, and especially of the most important circumstances of the act and its end. But if an action is to be called involuntary because of such ignorance, it should be painful to the agent and excite in him a feeling of regret. Chapter 3. As an act is involuntary if done under compulsion or from ignorance, it would seem to follow that it is voluntary if the actor starts it in full knowledge of the particular circumstances of his act. It is probably wrong to call all acts of passion or desire involuntary, for on that principle in the first place, none of the lower animals could be said to act voluntarily, nor could children. And secondly, it is suggested that nothing we do from desire or passion is voluntary, or are our noble acts done voluntarily, and our shameful acts involuntarily. Surely the latter view is ridiculous, if one and the same feeling is the cause of both kinds of act. It would seem strange to say that the things we ought to desire we desire involuntarily. There are things about which we ought to be angry, and things, such as health and learning, which we ought to desire. Again, we think the involuntary is painful, but what we do from desire is pleasant. Again, what difference is there as to involuntariness between errors committed in cold reason and errors committed in anger? It is our duty to avoid both, but the irrational emotions seem to be as truly human as reason itself. So the acts that spring from passion and desire are no less the acts of the man than his rational acts. It is absurd, therefore, to regard them as involuntary. Chapter 4. Having thus distinguished voluntary from involuntary action, we must go on to discuss moral purpose, for moral purpose is evidently most closely related to virtue, and is a better test of character than acts are. Moral purpose is clearly something voluntary. Still, moral purpose and the will are not identical. The will is the broader term. For children and the lower animals have a share in will, they do not share in moral purpose. Also, we speak of acts done on the spur of the moment as voluntary, but not as done with a moral purpose. Those then who define moral purpose as desire or passion or wish or opinion of some sort are mistaken, for moral purpose is not like desire and passion, common both to irrational creatures and to man. Again, an intemperate person acts from desire, but not from moral purpose. On the other hand, a temperate person acts from moral purpose, but not from desire. Desire, too, is opposed to moral purpose, but desire is not opposed to desire. Desire, too, though not moral purpose, is directed toward pleasures and pains. Still less can moral purpose be the same as passion, for no acts seem so little directed by moral purpose as those which spring from angry passion. Nor, again, is moral purpose the same as wishing, although it seems nearly allied to it, for moral purpose does not apply to impossibilities. Anyone who said he had a purpose of achieving the impossible would be thought a fool. But there is such a thing as wishing for the impossible, as, for example, for immortality. Again, we may wish for things which could not possibly be won by our own efforts, as for the victory of a certain actor or athlete, but we cannot purpose such things. We only purpose what we think we can bring to pass by our own act. Again, a wish is directed rather to an end, but a moral purpose to the means. Thus, we wish to be healthy, but we purpose or choose the means of keeping our health. Or again, we wish to be happy, and say so, but we cannot appropriately say that we purpose or choose to be happy. For in general, our moral purpose seems limited to things that lie within our own power. Nor, once more, can moral purpose be opinion, for the sphere of opinion is everywhere. We have opinions on things which are eternal or impossible as much as on things which are within our own power. Opinion, too, unlike moral purpose, is distinguished as true or false, not as good or evil. Nobody perhaps maintains that moral purpose is identical with opinion generally, but neither is it identical with opinion of any particular kind. For according as we purpose or choose what is good or evil, and not according as we hold particular opinions, are we men of a certain character. Again, we choose to accept or avoid something and so on, but we have opinions as to what a thing is, or for whom or how it is beneficial. We have no opinion not to accept or avoid a thing. Again, moral purpose is praised more for being directed to a proper end than for being correct. Opinion is praised for being true. Again, we purpose or choose what we best know to be good, but we form an opinion of things which we have little knowledge. Again, it is not the people who make the best moral choice who form the best opinions. Some who form a better opinion than others are prevented by vice from making the right choice. Opinion may precede moral purpose or follow it, but that is not the point. The question we are considering is simply this: whether moral purpose is identical with opinion of some kind. What then is the nature and character of moral purpose? Since it is none of the things we have mentioned, it is clearly voluntary, but there are things which are voluntary and yet not purposed. It is then the result of previous deliberation, for moral purpose implies reason and thought. The very name seems to indicate something chosen deliberately in preference to other things. Chapter 5. The question is, do we deliberate about everything? Is everything a matter for deliberation, or are there some things that are not subjects for deliberation? Presumably, we understand by a matter for deliberation, not that about which a fool or a madman would deliberate, but about which a sensible person would. Nobody deliberates about eternal things, that is, the unchangeable, such as the universe, or the incommensurability of the diagonal and the side of a square, or about things in motion that always follow the same course, whether of necessity or by nature, or for some other cause, as the solstices and the risings of the sun, or about things which are wholly irregular, like droughts and showers, or about chance happenings, such as the finding of a treasure. Nor again are all human affairs matters of deliberation. Thus, no Spartan will deliberate about the best constitution for the Scythians. The reason we do not deliberate about these things is that none of them can be affected by our action. The matters about which we deliberate are practical matters lying within our power. There is, in fact, no other class of matters left, for the cause of things are evidently nature, necessity, chance, and besides these, only intelligence and human agency in its various forms. Now, different classes of people do deliberate about things that depend on their own efforts. The sciences which are exact and complete in themselves do not admit of deliberation, as, for example, writing. For we are in no doubt as to the proper way of writing. But a thing that depends on our own effort and is not invariable is a matter of deliberation, such as problems of medicine or finance. Navigation is more so than gymnastic, for it is less thoroughly systematized, and similarly all other arts. The arts are more matters of deliberation than the sciences, since we are in more doubt about them. We deliberate over cases which fall under general rules, when it is uncertain what the issue will be, and when we can make no absolute decision. We invite the help of other people in our deliberations over questions of importance when we distrust our own ability to decide them. We deliberate not about ends, but about means to ends. Thus, a doctor does not deliberate whether he shall cure his patients, nor an orator whether he shall persuade his audience, nor a statesman whether he shall produce law and order, nor does anyone else deliberate about his end. They all set up a certain end and then consider how and by what means it can be attained. And if it apparently can be attained by several means, they consider what will be the easiest and best means of attaining it. And if there is but one means of attaining it, how to attain it by this means, and by what means the means can be attained, until they come to the first cause, which in the order of discovery is last. For deliberation, it seems, as we have described it, is a process of investigation and analysis. It is like the analysis of a geometrical figure. Not all investigation, however, is deliberation. Mathematical investigation is not, but deliberation is always investigation. And that which comes last in the order of analysis is first in the order of action. If in deliberation we come on an impossibility, we abandon our task, as for instance, if we need money and cannot get it. But if the thing appears possible, we set about doing it. By possibilities, I mean things that may be brought about by our own efforts. For what is done by our friends we may call done by ourselves, since the origin of it lies in ourselves. Sometimes the question is what tools are necessary, and at other times how to use them. Similarly, in all cases, it is sometimes the means of doing a thing, and at other times the method or the agency that is the question. If the object of our moral purpose is that which, being in our power, is after deliberation the object of our desire, it follows that the moral purpose is a deliberate desire for something in our power. For first we deliberate on a thing, and, after reaching a decision on it, we desire it in accordance with our deliberation. Let us now leave this sketch of the moral purpose. We have shown what are the matters with which it deals, and that it is directed to means rather than to ends. Chapter 6. We have said that wishing is directed to an end. There are people who hold that the end is a good, and others that it is what seems to be good. If the object of wishing is a good, it follows that where a person's moral purpose or choice is wrong, he wishes for something not in the proper sense an object of wish. For if it is an object of wish, it will be good, but it was perhaps an evil. If, on the other hand, the object of wishing is what seems to be good, it follows that there is no such thing as a natural object of wish, but in every man's case it is that which seems good to him. Now different, and it may be opposite things, seem good to different people. If these are unsatisfactory conclusions, it will perhaps be best to say that in an absolute or true sense, it is the good which is the object of wishing, but that for each individual, it is what seems to him good. Hence, the true good is good to the virtuous man, and something, we cannot tell what, is good to the bad man. The case is much the same with the body. When people are in good health, the truly wholesome things are wholesome to them. But when they are sick, other things are. The same with things that are bitter, sweet, hot, heavy, and so on. A good man is the right judge in every case, and that which is true appears true to him. For every moral state has its own idea of honor and pleasure. Nor is there perhaps any mark so distinctive of the good man as his power of seeing the truth in all cases, because he is, as it were, himself the standard and measure of things. Pleasure seems to be what most frequently deceives people, for pleasure seems to be a good when it is not. As a result, we choose what is pleasant as if it were good, and avoid pain as if it were evil. Chapter 7. The end, then, is the object of wishing, and the means to the end the objects of deliberation and moral purpose. It follows that action concerned with the means will be guided by moral purpose and voluntary. Now, the exercise of virtue has to do with means. Virtue and vice are both alike in our own power, for where it is in our power to act, it is also in our power not to act. And where it is in our power not to act, it is also in our power to act. Hence, If it is in our power to act when action is noble, it will also be in our power not to act when action is shameful. And if it is in our power not to act when an action is noble, it will also be in our power to act when action is shameful. But if it is in our power to do and likewise not to do what is noble and shameful, and if this action or inaction means, as we have seen, being good or bad, it follows that it is in our power to be good or wicked. The saying, quote, "None would will to be wicked, none would not be blessed," close quote, seems to be partly false and partly true, for while nobody would be blessed against his will, wickedness is voluntary. Otherwise, we shall have to dispute the statements we have just made and say that a man is not the originator or father of his acts as he is of his family. But if these statements are true and we cannot refer our acts to any other source than what lies in ourselves, then the act that has its sources in us must itself be in our power and voluntary. This view is apparently supported by the testimony both of private individuals and of lawmakers. For lawmakers punish and chastise evildoers, unless they did wrong under compulsion or from ignorance, for which they were not responsible. But they honor people who do noble acts, their object being to discourage the one class of deeds and encourage the other. Yet no one encourages us to do what is not in our own power or voluntary. It would be useless, for instance, to persuade us not to get hot, or to feel pain or hunger, or anything of that kind, for we should feel the sensations all the same. We do punish a person for mere ignorance if it seems he is responsible for it. Thus, punishments for drunken people who commit a crime are double, because the source of the crime lies in the person himself, if it was in his power not to get drunk, and his drunkenness was the cause of his ignorance. Again, we punish people who are ignorant of a point of law, if they ought to know it and could easily do so. Similarly, in other cases, we punish people whenever it seems that their ignorance was due to carelessness, for they had it in their power not to be ignorant, since they might have taken the trouble to inform themselves. But perhaps the man is the sort that cannot take trouble. Even so, people are responsible for having made themselves persons of that kind by their dissolute lives, or for becoming unjust or licentious by acts of dishonesty, spending their time on drink and other such things. For a person's character is the result of the way in which he exercises his capabilities. The rule is proved by those who train for any competition or action, for they never stop practicing. Now, only a fool does not know that moral states are formed by the exercise of our powers in one way or another. It is absurd to say that a man who acts unjustly does not wish to be unjust, or that one who acts licentiously does not wish to be licentious. If a man, acting not in ignorance, commits the acts that will make him unjust, he will be voluntarily unjust. However, it does not follow that, if he wishes, he may cease to be unjust and become just, any more than it follows that a sick man, if he wishes, will be well. It may be that he is voluntarily ill through living intemperately and disobeying his doctors. If so, it was once in his power not to be ill, but since he has thrown away his chance, it is no longer in his power. Similarly, once a man has thrown a stone, it is no longer in his power to call it back. Still, for all that, it was in his power to throw it, since the source of the act was in him. So, too, the unjust or licentious man had it in his power at first not to become so. Hence, he is voluntarily unjust or licentious. But once he has become unjust or licentious, it is no longer open to him not to be so. Not only vices of the soul, but vices of the body are also voluntary in some cases, and in these cases blameworthy. For while nobody blames people who are born ugly, we do blame those whose ugliness arises from negligence and want of exercise. It is the same with bodily infirmities and defects. Nobody would find fault with a person who is born blind or whose blindness is the result of illness or a blow. He would rather be an object of pity. But if his blindness were the result of intemperance or licentiousness of any kind, he would be universally blamed. Such bodily vices then as depend on ourselves are blamable, and such as do not depend on ourselves as not. If so, it follows that the other vices, if they are blamed, must depend on ourselves. We may say, however, that we all aspire after what seems to be good, only we are not masters of appearances, and the appearance which the end takes in the eyes of each of us depends on his character. But if each of us is in some degree responsible for his character, he will in some degree be responsible for the appearance. If not, nobody is responsible for his evil doing. Everybody acts as he does from ignorance of the end, under the impression that by this means he is gaining the supreme good. The aspiration after the true end is not a matter of our choice, and a man must be born with a sort of vision to enable him to form a noble judgment and choose what is truly good. He then, who is endowed with this noble judgment, is nature's nobleman. For he possesses the greatest and noblest of all gifts, a gift which can never be received nor learned from anybody else, but must always be kept as nature herself kept it. To possess this natural gift of virtue and honor is to have a perfect and true excellence of nature. If this were true, how then would virtue be more voluntary than vice? But for both men alike, the good and the bad, the end is plain and fixed by nature or whatever it is. And to these ends men direct all their acts, whatever they do. Whether the end then, whatever it be that any individual regards as his end, is not so presented to him by nature, but depends in part on himself, or whether the end is fixed by nature, the good man uses voluntary all means to gain the end. In either case, virtue is voluntary and vice is voluntary as much as virtue. For in the bad man lies as great a power over his own acts, if not over his end. If, as is generally allowed, the virtues are voluntary, for we are ourselves somehow in part responsible for our moral states, and because we possess a certain character, the end we set before ourselves is of such kind, it follows that our vices too must be voluntary, for what is true of one is equally true of the other. Chapter 8. We have now described in outline the nature of virtues in general. We have shown that they are the means between two vices, and they are moral states. We have explained what are the causes that produce them, and how their natural result is the performance of acts by which they are further produced, that they are in our power and voluntary, and governed by the rule of right reason. But acts and states of character are not voluntary in the same sense. For we are masters of our acts from beginning to end, if we know the facts in the case. But we are masters of only the beginning of our characters. We do not perceive the particular steps of their progress, as we do not perceive the particular steps in a disease. Yet because it was in our power to act in this way or that, our characters are voluntary. Chapter 9. Let us now consider the various virtues and discuss their nature, the matters with which they deal, and the way they deal with them. In so doing, we shall ascertain their number. We will begin with courage. We have already stated that courage is a mean state between sentiments of fear and confidence. It is clear, too, that the things we fear are frightful, and frightful things may be broadly described as evil. Hence, fear is sometimes described as an anticipation of evil. Now, although we fear everything evil, such as disgrace, poverty, disease, friendlessness, death, they do not all give scope for a display of courage. Some things it is right and noble to fear, and a shame not to fear. Disgrace, for example, for to fear disgrace is to be virtuous and modest, and not to fear it is to be shameless. A shameless person is sometimes called brave by a twist of speech, because he looks something like a brave man, for a brave man too is fearless. It is perhaps wrong to fear poverty or sickness or anything else that is not the result of vice or one's own fault. Still, to be fearless of these things is not necessarily courage, though we speak of one who is fearless of them as brave by analogy. For some men who are cowardly in perils of battle are yet liberal and confident when losing money. Nor is a man a coward if he fears insults to his children or his wife, or envy or any such thing, nor is he brave if he swaggers before a flogging. What then is the nature of the fearful things before which a courageous man is brave? Certainly the worst kind of fearful things, for nobody is better able to face dangers than he. Now, nothing is so frightful as death, for death is the end, and when a man is dead, it seems that he is beyond the reach of good or evil. But on all occasions does a man prove his courage even by facing death, whether death at sea or from disease? On what occasions then? Surely the noblest, that is, occasions such as occur in battle, for that is the greatest and noblest peril. For this reason special honors are paid, alike in free states and in monarchies, to citizens who die on the field of battle. Strictly speaking, then, we may call a man brave if he is fearless in face of a noble death, and in all such sudden emergencies as bring death near, especially therefore in face of the risks of war. Still, the brave man is fearless in disease and at sea too, though not in the same way as a seaman. For a landsman loses hope of safety and detests the prospect of a watery grave, while the experience of the seamen keep them more sanguine. People display their courage better on occasions when they can show prowess, or when death is glorious, but in death at sea or from disease there is scant room for courage or glory. Chapter 10. People are not all terrified by the same things. Some things indeed we feel are beyond the power of human endurance, and such things therefore are terrible to every intelligent person. But terrors that are not beyond the power of endurance vary in magnitude and degree. The same is true of things that inspire confidence. The brave man is unshakable, as far as a man may be. Hence, though he will fear terrifying things, he will face them in the right way and in a rational spirit for honor's sake, since this is the end of virtue. But it is possible to fear these things too much or too little, and also to fear things that are not frightful as if they were. A fault is committed when the fear itself is wrong, or is wrong in manner of expression, or in time, or the like. The same with things which inspire confidence. Thus, he who faces and fears the right things for the right motive, in the right way, and at the right time, and whose confidence is similarly right, is a brave man. For the brave man in his emotions and his actions has a sense of fitness and obeys the law of reason. Now, the end of every man's action is determined by his particular character. To the brave man, courage is noble. Therefore, the end or object of his courage is also noble, and the nature of everything is determined by its end. For a noble end, then, the brave man faces and does all that his courage demands. As for a man who goes to excess, there is no name for one whose fearlessness is excessive. It is one of the many states which, as we have already remarked, have no names. But he would be an insane or insensible creature who feared nothing at all, not even an earthquake nor a storm at sea, as the Celts are said to do. A man excessively rash in facing frightful things is called foolhardy. The foolhardy person, however, may be thought to be an impostor, a boaster of courage that he does not possess. He wishes to seem to face frightful things in the spirit in which the brave man really does face them. Therefore, he imitates him as far as he safely can. So most foolhardy people are cowards at heart, for although they show a foolhardy spirit where they safely can, they refuse to face real terrors. One whose fear is excessive is a coward, for he fears the wrong things and fears them in the wrong way, and so on. He is lacking too in confidence, but he reveals himself more by his excess of fear in the presence of pain. The coward is a despondent sort of person, for he is afraid of everything. The contrary is true of the brave man, for a confident person is naturally sanguine. Thus the coward, the foolhardy person, and the brave man who face the same things assume different attitudes toward them. For the two first go either too far or not far enough, and the third holds the middle position, which is right. Also, the foolhardy are precipitate and eager before the hour of danger, but fail in its presence, while the brave are keen in the height of action, but quiet before the hour of action arrives. While the brave are keen in the height of action, but quiet before the hour of action arrives. Chapter 11. Courage, then, as has been said, is a mean state with regard to things that cause confidence or fear in the circumstances described. It chooses action or endures pain because it is honorable to do so, or because the opposite course is disgraceful. But to die, to escape from poverty or love or anything painful, is the act not of a courageous person, but of a coward, for it is weakness to fly from troubles. Nor does the suicide face death because it is noble, but because it is a refuge from evil. Chapter 13. We shall next consider temperance, for both courage and temperance, it seems, are virtues of the irrational part of human nature. We have said already that temperance is a mean state with regard to pleasures, for it is not in the same degree or manner concerned with pains. Pleasure is also the sphere in which licentiousness or intemperance displays itself. Let us therefore define now the character of these pleasures. We will accept the distinction commonly made between bodily and spiritual or intellectual pleasures, such as love of honor and love of learning, for he who loves either honor or learning finds pleasure in the object of his love, though his body is not affected, but only his mind. However, people addicted to pleasures of this kind are not called either temperate or licentious. It is the same with all other pleasures that are not bodily. Thus, people who are fond of talking and telling stories and spend their days on trifles we call gossips. But we do not call them licentious, nor do we call people licentious who are pained at the loss of money or of friends. Temperance, then, is an attitude toward bodily pleasures only, and not toward all even of these. For people who delight in pleasures of sight, in colors, forms, and paintings, are not called either temperate or licentious. Yet it would seem possible to take either a right or an excessive or an insufficient pleasure in all these things as well as in others. It is the same with pleasures of the ear. Nobody speaks of people who take excessive delight in music or acting as licentious, or of people who take a proper delight as temperate. Nor again do we call people who enjoy the pleasures of smell licentious or temperate, except incidentally. We do not call them licentious if they are charmed by the fragrance of apples or roses or incense, but are more apt to do so if they gloat over the odors of ointments and sauces. For these are things a licentious person enjoys, because they remind him of the objects of his appetite. It is true we may see other people when they are hungry, delighting in the smell of food, but it is only a licentious person who habitually gloats over such things, since they are the objects of his appetite. The lower animals do not, in general, take pleasure in these senses, except incidentally. Dogs do not enjoy the scent of hare's flesh, but only the eating of it, though the scent tells them the hares are nearby. Again, a lion takes no delight in hearing an ox lowing, but in eating the ox. However, the lowing tells him the ox is near, and so he appears to delight in the lowing. Similarly, it is not the sight of a stag or a wild goat that gives him joy, but the prospect of a meal. Temperance and licentiousness, however, have to do with the kinds of pleasure that the lower animals generally are capable of, which therefore appear slavish and brutish. They are pleasures of touch and taste. But taste comes little, if at all, into question, for taste is a judgment of flavor, as when men taste wine or seasoned dishes. But this judgment of flavors give them no special pleasure, at least not those who are licentious. They want rather the full enjoyment which comes invariably through the sense of touch, both in meat and in drink, and in what are called the pleasures of love. This was why a certain gourmand prayed that his throat might become longer than a crane's, showing that his pleasure was derived from the sense of contact. Thus, the sense with which temperance is associated is the most universal of the senses. It would seem then right to disapprove of intemperance, since it is a mark not of our human nature, but of our animal nature. To find delight and supreme satisfaction in such things is beastly. The most liberal and refined of the pleasures of touch, such as the comforts of rubbing and of taking a hot bath in the gymnasium, we do not count, because the sense as the licentious man cultivates is not a matter of the whole body, but only of certain parts. Of appetites and desires, some are universal and others peculiar to individuals and acquired. The desire for food is natural. Everybody who is without it desires meat or drink, or perhaps both. A young man, too, in the springtime of life, says Homer, desires the love of a woman. But not everybody wants one particular form of gratification or the same things. Hence, such a particular desire is peculiar to ourselves as individuals. Nevertheless, there is something natural in it, for different people enjoy different things, and some things are pleasanter to everyone than others. Now, in their natural desires, few make a mistake, and their mistake is only on one side, that of excess. For to eat or drink anything to the point of surfeit is to exceed the natural limit, since natural desire does not go beyond the satisfaction of our need. Those persons, accordingly, are called gluttons, who go beyond what is right in filling their stomachs. Only those who are exceedingly slavish behave in this way. But with regards to pleasure peculiar to the individual, there are many who go wrong and go wrong in many ways. For people who are said to be unduly fond of particular things either take pleasure in wrong things, or take more pleasure than most people, or take their pleasure in a wrong way. And the intemperate are guilty of excess in all these forms. For they both find joy in things which are detestable and wrong, and when they are things which it is right to enjoy, they enjoy them more than is right, or than most people do. It is clear then that excess in pleasure is licentiousness and blameworthy. When it comes to pain, however, a person is not, as in the case of courage, called temperate if he bears pain well, and intemperate if he does not. But the intemperate person is so called because he suffers more than he should at not getting his pleasure being the cause of his pain, and the temperate man is so called because he is not pained at the absence of pleasure and his failure to get it. Chapter 14. The intemperate man then wants all pleasures, or the greatest pleasures, and is led by his desire to choose them above everything else. He is pained, therefore, both when he fails to get them and when he is simply longing for them, for all desire involves pain. Yet it seems paradoxical to say that his pleasure is the cause of his pain. We never find people with no love of pleasure, or whose delight in it is less than it should be. Such insensibility is not human, for even the lower animals distinguish different kinds of food, liking some and disliking others. A being who took no pleasure in anything, nor made any difference between one thing and another, would be something far different from a man. There is no name for such a being, as he does not exist. The temperate man keeps a middle position with regard to pleasure. He does not enjoy the things which the licentious man likes best, he rather dislikes them. Nor does he find any pleasure in wrong things, nor too much in any pleasure. Nor is he pained at the absence of such things, nor has he a craving for them, except perhaps in moderation, not more than is right, and not at the wrong time, and so on. But in a moderate and right spirit he will want all things that are pleasant, and that at the same time make for health and a sound bodily condition, and whatever other pleasures are not prejudicial to these ends, or opposed to what is noble, or costly beyond his means. For unless a person limits himself in this way, he indulges in pleasures more than he should, whereas a temperate man follows the guidance of right reason.